All right, so for today's speaker is Dr. Jarrod Miller. He is the extension agronomist for the University of Delaware. He is going to be giving a talk on plant nutrient sources, soil minerals, the atmosphere, and organic matter.
All right, thanks, Megan. Everything clear? Look good?
It looks good.
All right. So this was a talk. If you went to crop school, sorry, you're going to see the same talk. Sometimes we have to recycle these when we get a lot going on. So this is what we would call an in situ natural soil science talk. And a lot of what this comes from, we're not talking about fertilizers or how you're going to add nutrients. This talk comes about because there's been a lot of discussion sometimes with soil health. We'd have people at meetings saying, if you maintain your soil health, you don't have to fertilize. It's rare, but some people have said that. And a lot of this talk is to point out that soils do have natural levels of nutrients. It's very variable, and they're not always all available. And some soils have higher natural nutrient levels than others. So a lot of our nutrient sources in terms of growing crops that we would think about, we have our fertilizers, which is not what we're discussing, but anything that we'd add from chicken litter to commercial fertilizers. We have natural levels of nutrients in the soil. Every soil has all these micronutrients. It's how plants would have developed with the soils, the levels of nutrients that would have been in there that would feed the plants. We can talk about plant residues and organic matter because those are natural parts of the soil as they recycle. Plant roots will bring nutrients up from deep in the soil and deposit them on the surface. And then we do have atmospheric deposition, particularly nitrogen and sulfur. This itself is enough to maintain a forest. But when we talk about agriculture, the nitrogen and sulfur that comes from the atmosphere, that's what would maintain an ecosystem. But agriculture is high production. And then you also have to consider that you're pulling these nutrients off to feed people. They're going somewhere else, so you have to put them back in. But most of this talk is going to refer to what natural levels of nutrients are in our soils. So if you haven't been out of your region much and dug in the soil, you might not realize how diverse soils actually are and how different they can be. This is an Appalachian soil. This is Piedmont of Virginia. This is a sand dune in South Carolina, another Appalachian in Virginia. Here's the sassafras from Maryland. This is a vertisol, shrink swell soil, very highly weathered soil on the Piedmont of Virginia. And then, of course, one of our wetter soils along the coastline that has a shallow water table. So soils have a lot of variability in themselves. They have a lot of different nutrient contents as well and how they cycle these nutrients. So they're very diverse. So when we talk about that your soil has natural levels of nutrients, remember that not all soils are made the same. And you know this from just walking your fields, the difference in production. And it's not just the moisture content or how saturated it is. You really can have a variable amounts of different micronutrients across some of these soils because of this diversity. So parent materials are what soils form from. This is a soil genesis term, soil formation term. We talk about the parent material that your soil forms from because a lot of our soils were originally bedrock, and this rock is going to slowly break down and turn into the soil that's above it. If this erodes off and gets deposited, it can also become sediments, which is a lot of what the coastal plain is. All these upland soils from, say, the Piedmont, Appalachians, Pennsylvania, would have weathered down onto Delmarva. And so this soil weathered from bedrock, had natural nutrient content, and then that stuff gets carried downstream and ends up being deposited on where we're at on the coastline. So the nutrient contents, the reason this is important is because the natural nutrient levels in your soil that come from this, it's going to be related to the material it formed in. So if you have a bedrock that's very fertile, then your soil is going to be fertile. If you have a highly weathered sand, a sediment left behind that all the nutrients were carried out with it and it's just silica left, it's going to be poor in nutrient content. And most of what I'm talking about is actually micronutrients and some of the macros. So in terms of soil parent materials, which your soil forms from, there's two ways we can look at it. We can look at mineral and we can look at organic. And they don't always call organic materials parent materials, but if you have drained a swamp to farm it, say back in the 60s or 70s, if you've drained that, your soil was dominantly organic materials versus mineral materials. But most of our soils and most of our ag soils are mineral, means inorganic. It doesn't contain carbon. you are organic yourself because you're carbon molecules. So these minerals, the sand, silt, and clay portion, they're inorganic, like salts, like vitamins, anything like that. They form from bedrock into soils. They can erode and deposit by water, like the coastal plain, river floodplains. We can also have sand dunes, which we're used to along the coastline here, but also loess. Loess is a very fine, it's like a powder. If you've ever worked, particularly, let's say, Dorchester County, southern part of Dorchester County, and then somewhat up through the middle coastal plain or the middle of Delmarva, when the glaciers backed off, they ground up a lot of the rock into silt. It would blow with the wind and we would get these deposits. So some of the silty material that we have on the surface of Delmarva is actually some wind-blown materials. It's not just all moved by water. And then our organic stuff, our swamps and our bogs, certainly, but then any surface organic material that's added is going to be a parent material at the surface. So bedrock soils, we might not have to deal with a lot of this on the coastal plain unless you dig down deep enough. But if you do have farms on the western shore, or you own farms or work with farmers on that side, you do need to understand the difference, because they can actually have some parent materials that are very fertile on that side compared to what we have. So these different rock types can really show you, the more color you see in a rock, the more nutrients that are in there. It's just more complex. This quartz down here is silica dioxide with some impurities. It doesn't have a lot of nutrients, particularly micronutrients. These darker colors here are probably magnesium and manganese. These pink colors here are probably potassium and sodium feldspar. So this granite itself is going to have more nutrients, going to be more fertile. The sandstone that would have formed later, the sedimentary rock, you can see it's rich in iron, but it's probably also rich in a lot of silica. So it's helpful to know the bedrock. You can't do anything about it, but if you can look at a soil map or geologic map and see what's under your feet, it can give you an idea of why this farm over here keeps having a manganese deficiency, but this one never did, because it's formed off of granite. So some of the rock types, if you remember geology, and this is generally important. You don't have to be a rock expert, but it's just to let you know the variation in a rock type. So igneous forms from volcanic. Sedimentary, we kind of covered that. These coastal soils, if they get buried, they can turn into sedimentary rocks. They can eventually be cemented into sedimentary rocks. A lot of this is out in the Appalachians. And then metamorphic is things that are changed by temperature and pressure. So this igneous rock can become metamorphic, and the sedimentary rock can become metamorphic if it's buried and has that temperature and pressure on it. So you can see what might have happened to this igneous rock here. If it goes under temperature and pressure, some of these separate grains here can be pressurized and they can turn into like these stripes that you see across there. So that's your metamorphic. So your igneous rock, it can be very fertile. It's going to contain nutrients based on whatever the volcanic material was. Metamorphic is changed by temperature and pressure. So the nutrient content's the same, but then you have to start thinking about how fast does it break down. It's not just the rock type people have to be concerned with. You're going to see that rocks with smaller crystals weather faster. So you can have the same rock with different nutrient contents, but the one that weathers faster is going to add nutrients, replace nutrients in your soil faster. And then sedimentary, they can have the least nutrient content, because if you think about it, they're like secondary rocks. You have igneous form volcanic, weathers into soil, soil erodes off, gets deposited, turns into sedimentary rock. Those nutrients that are soluble, they might move on out to sea. So they can be low in fertility. This is a paper. It was actually talking about mycorrhizae in the soil, but what I liked about it is it listed all these nutrient contents as some rock types. So basalt, rhyolite, granite, and schist. Again, don't memorize rocks. Look at this pattern here. Look at this basalt. The red boxes here are the highest nutrient content across these soils, these rock types. Basalt has the highest phosphorus, calcium, magnesium, manganese, iron. Granite itself, we know granite because of granite countertops. Granite itself is very high in silica. That's one of its highest things. It has a lot of quartz in it. Does it have nutrients? Yes, sure. It's got iron. It has manganese, but it's not a whole lot different. It has more magnesium than, say, rhyolite does, but not more than schist. Schist has a lot of aluminum because it's a lot of clay minerals in it as well. So if your soil forms on basalt, and if you know, say the Piedmont, where it borders with the coastal plain, Harford County actually there's basalt running underneath some of those farms up there. So they can have basalt and granite. And so some farms there in that region might be a little more fertile than others. The other thing to consider, what I have in an orange box, is if you have more aluminum silica, they're also going to be slower weathering. So not only does granite have lower nutrients than basalt, it weathers a lot slower. So it's not going to provide them as fast. And you can see it when you look at this picture. So here you have these really large crystals. So it weathers slower. Same thing here with gneiss. They've been mashed together, but they're still larger crystals. And then you have basalt. This is the stuff that cools first out of a volcano. Very fine crystals because it cools so fast. So it's full of nutrients for plants. And then because it has these smaller crystals, it weathers faster. So these soils can be naturally what we call more basic, and it can be a more alkaline soil. And you can have these rock types across this region, across a county, within a couple miles of each other. And within a field, sometimes you can see these different rock types. So the reason you want to understand this, if you farm the same land over and over, you get used to the natural nutrient content. If you rent different land, if you talk to people that have different practice and they're like, well, I never have to add manganese. Well, there might be a reason why they don't. And it could very well be, it's just the natural levels of soils are going to have. Sedimentary rocks, this is Appalachia that deals with this. So there's variability in their rock types. Limestone formed under warm seas. That's where you're going to find a lot of your fossils. If you like to search for fossils, go find limestone alongside the road, a limestone cut. And that's where you're going to see, your shells, because these formed in warm, shallow seas. And there's a lot of carbonates in them because that's what's making up these shells, right? If you've ever tossed shells out into your garden where you've had ground up shells, you know they can be a lime source. And so you can have natural levels of calcium and magnesium in this soil. This is a very highly siliceous sandstone. You can see where the deer have been rubbing on this on their antlers, but this is on the very top of a mountain for a reason, because it's very hard to weather this rock. And so this is where it ends up. This is where the higher peaks of Appalachia are often, these rocks were harder to weather. And then the shale, which is a clay, it has very fine particle sizes. The nutrient content just depends on what was deposited there, what was left behind. And the reason these rocks are important, and the reason understanding it seems, I think sometimes people in biology or people like to grow plants, they don't always look at the geology or think about it, but this is feeding your plants. There's the nutrient content, there's the soils they're forming, the water holding. It's very important to have a general idea of geology. You don't have to be an expert. And some people find rocks boring, but if you include them in the whole pattern of agriculture, if you think about how they're connected, you start to see stuff like this. And I got lucky to work on a project where we were looking at what kind of rock. So after they mine, so this is a strip mine. They take this mountain, they strip the whole thing off to get to the coal. But that coal was a swamp. So it can end up getting buried between different layers of sand or silt or clay. And what they wanted to know was, well, after we mine this and we put this stone back, what's the best stone that's going to reforest this area? So they had a couple that they could pick from. The brown sandstone is usually closest to the surface, so it's weathered. That's why it's brown, like a weathered soil. Then they have a gray sandstone here. This gray sandstone is a little deeper, not as weathered. A shale that's going to have more clay in here. And then they mix the shale and that together. So this brown sandstone is more weathered, so it's going to have a higher nutrient content. And because it's close to the surface, any nitrogen and phosphorus that moved down from the soils above it also would have deposited in this rock. So you kind of already have an idea. This picture would have been 2007 or 8. About 10 years later, here's what you see. In 10 years, even though they planted trees across every single one of these, the shale has clay. It has water holding and some nutrients. Gray sandstone, not very weathered, not a lot of water holding, not a lot of nutrients. Mixing these together gets you something, but look at how the difference in just having some nitrogen and phosphorus in that rock to begin with. And that was the big push here. So understanding those rocks can be important. The geology underneath can influence how things grow. So sandstone should be less fertile. I would think, well, no matter what, there wouldn't be much difference between a brown and a gray sandstone, but there was. It was a big difference. And if you look at this Google Earth map, you can really get an idea of 2008 versus say about 2020, and where all this brown sandstone was put. They're supposed to be randomized. I don't know how they ended up close to each other. But here's your gray sandstone here, here. It doesn't even have voluntary growth. So the bedrock is important. The rock, the parent material is important with what we deal with. On the coastal plain, we deal with soils that form from sediments. So they can be sandy. This is very extreme. It's just the easiest way to show you sand. This is a sand dune in Delaware. It's a very extreme, not easy to do anything with ag. But if you go across the center of Delmarva, a lot of our soils are very, very sandy like this. This is Blackwater in Dorchester County, if you've ever been there. So they can be high in organic matter. We're not really allowed to drain these anymore, but back when they did drain these, you would have a very fertile soil for a very short amount of time, eventually running out of organic matter. And this is actually from the Somerset County Extension Office. This would be more the finer texture that runs along the western side of Delmarva. So you have to think about where sediments come from, because that's going to predict their fertility. This is a Piedmont field up at the top of the Chesapeake Bay. And so you can see kind of this gully in here. It's going to erode down. It's going to get down to this stream, and it's going to be carried downstream. And eventually you get down here where you have slower moving rivers. And when you have a flooding event, it's gonna deposit things across here. And it can be sand, silt, or clay. This is going to change over time. Fast moving waters deposit sand. Slow moving waters deposit even organic matter, but clays and silts and even nutrients, and leave that behind. So slow flooding event, very fertile. A fast flooding event, maybe just some sands or stones. So you think about, you might have a fertile bedrock here, but if the nutrients are soluble, where do they stay? They stay in the water and they move on out to sea. And what you get left with is weathered sediments. So our soils should be, compared to the Piedmont, they should be lower in nutrient content. This is a good example that shows you the variability that you might see as you dig down through your soil, because these rivers can move back and forth, these streams move back and forth. You have wind blown at some time. You can get these different layers across here. So here we have very low stone in this section right here. And then you get a lot of stone, and then you get silt, and then you have a stone layer again. So it's kind of showing you that this creek or river, whatever was here, was moving back and forth. And so even as you go down, you think you have one type of soil, but as your roots move down through here, they're hitting different types of parent material and different water holding and different nutrient contents. So our heaviest particles settle out first. So this tells you this is probably the stream bed if you have stones in it. And then the stream bed maybe moved off over here, and then this became like a floodplain. And so occasional flooding, slow moving waters, you get silt and clay put here, and probably more nutrients. So I would guess if you did a fertility content, this is highest, then low, and then more organic matter and fertility in that layer here. But always remember that a lot of our nutrients that weathered out of these rocks, they more than likely stay soluble, and they more than likely keep being carried out to sea. Still, if you're on this floodplain, like the Pamunkey soil in Virginia, that's one of our highest fertility areas, because if you constantly get flooding, it's adding some nutrients, and it's also slowing down organic matter breakdown. So those can be some more fertile soils. We do have Aeolian windblown sand and silt. So this is a fresh sand dune. We're not going to grow anything here, but we are, some of our farms are going to be on old sand dunes that at the time when the coastline might have been there, you can be farming old sand dunes. So eventually they're going to settle out, get some vegetation and form a soil, but they can be very low in fertility and water holding, and there's not much you can do about it. This is Luss from Kentucky. It's a very fine textured material that was deposited over top of this, and you can actually form horizons down here where the limit water movement. And you can see that it cuts across, I think, Talbot up through Newark, Delaware. Some of the soils across there do have what they call a BX horizon that limits water movement. So across the mid-Atlantic, you have the Appalachian Plateau. Those are your sedimentary rocks. Valley and Ridge is sedimentary. Then we have our igneous and metamorphic in this section, and then where we're at. So all of these soils weathered and moved down in this direction and deposited the soils that we have on the coastal plain. So our coastal plain, we have weathered sediments. Piedmont, metamorphic, rocks with igneous intrusions from maybe some underground volcanic activity. Metamorphic rocks in the Blue Ridge where it was pushed up. And then our valley and ridge are these sedimentary carbonate shales in sandstones. I like this cross section because it's good to understand our region, particularly when we go to conferences or we go to Farm Bureau meetings statewide, and you're talking to different people, so you understand the difference in how they might be able to farm versus what you can do. So here you can see all these sedimentary rocks. Here's that Appalachian Plateau, think West Virginia. Here's the Ridge and Valley, Hagerstown area. This is actually cut across Virginia, so you have the Shenandoah Valley right through here, but same things running across Maryland. So where these rocks get folded, here you've got your sandstones on the top here. Here's your limestone that weathered out and formed the Great Valley. Blue Ridge, metamorphic rocks, but a lot of topography to it. And then our Piedmont, all these crystalline rocks. These soils are forming direct from bedrock. What bedrock's there depends on the county. And then you can see these coastal sediments that are sitting on top of that rock. So all of this weathered down here and deposit our soil. So we have, I call them like they're secondary soil. They're a little harder to manage. So here's the Appalachian Ridge and Valley. You can see the top of a ridge. So your limestone valley, calcium, magnesium, wire pastures there. Well, they should naturally have a higher pH. They don't always. It depends on how much calcium and magnesium is in that limestone. Sandstone ridges, is anybody farming up here on a very unfertile, hard to weather sandstone? No, you got steep slopes, but they're very unfertile. If this was a very fertile rock, you might consider putting something up here, but it's a lot easier to have a natural cycling forest up here where the nutrients just cycle in place versus constantly having to fertilize a crop. So parent material controls land use, and you can see it driving across the country at this point. Sometimes I tell people when they were interested in buying a piece of land that was forested along Delmarva, I'm like, there's probably a reason somebody left that in trees. You're not going to necessarily clear that field and make it productive because somebody probably already tried that. So it's always good to look across a landscape, and where you see agriculture kind of gives you an idea of what people already know. This would be some sandstone and Appalachian Plateau over towards Kentucky. Again, naturally we have steep slopes here, but look at this sandstone. You can barely grow trees on it. It just breaks down so slowly. It's not very fertile. So this landscape's telling you something about its fertility. Where do you have the pastures? Down on the bottom. Nice slopes, but probably you have water deposition carrying nutrients down here as well. The Blue Ridge can have fertile soils. The problem with it, they might weather slowly. The Blue Ridge just has topography. It's just better for pasture because it has a lot of steep slopes. It's better for topography. Here's the Piedmont in Maryland. So you can see these rolling hills. It tells you, if you see rolling hills like this, it's an old landscape. It's telling you that there was a lot of weathering that helped form these hills. But even here, you can't see it, but you can walk across. If you till any of these fields and pull up some stones, same field is where these stones came from. Highly silicious, low in nutrients. These dark colors tell me there's probably magnesium, manganese, iron. Some of the darker colors in here tell you it's nutrient rich. Same field, not too far apart. You can take a tissue sample from this part of the field and think you're lacking, and you take it here and you think you're fine. So coastal plain soils are those that are formed from sediments. And it's actually, I don't think I have it in this presentation, but if you ever look at, so you have DC here, and Richmond here, and Baltimore, Philadelphia. If you ever look, you can see the line of the coastal plain where all our major cities are. Because what happens is you have these slow-moving deep rivers across those coastal sediments, easy to weather deep rivers. Boats moved up this far. They got to here and couldn't make it because there's the stones. Like if you've ever crossed the Conowingo Dam in Harford County, you can see it. You can look out there and see where the stones are, and that's the edge of the coastal plain versus the Piedmont. This goes all the way down. Raleigh, North Carolina, Columbia, South Carolina, this line, they call it the fall line. And what you're seeing is where those sediments are on top of this bedrock. So when you hit this bedrock, rivers have rocks, boats couldn't go any further. So this landscape really influenced where all of our major and most of our capitals of most of the states are actually falling across a lot of these lines. So the coastal plain soils formed from sediments, so they're secondary. And we just kind of have to deal with the properties that are there. This is a general, this was from a USGS publication, but since I've come to Delaware, these soils are very sandy over here. So they say this is mixed texture. The center of Delmarva is the oldest portion, deposited first, is very sandy. And one of the ways you can tell is if you look at a map of center pivot irrigation, here's where it is. You don't see as much down here, but finer texture soils, they hold water better. You don't necessarily need it. So our sandy soil, I know this is a sand dune. It's hard to get a good picture of a sandy soil here. Sandy soils, as a soil scientist, why I love them is because they're really easy to take a soil sample versus clay or something full of rocks. But growing crops on a sandy soil is definitely more difficult. But the sandy soils run across the middle, are finer textured materials. We had sea level rose and fell in the past, and it deposited finer texture materials. And then of course, here's black water and all our swamps and soils along here. We can't necessarily, some are way too wet to farm, but if you can, then you have a high organic soil. In Delaware, we have this area here. These old swamps are very productive soils. So there's going to be variability, even though people might drive across here and all they do is go to the beach and they think everything is sandy. We have a lot of variability in Delmarva and our soil types itself and how we can manage them. And a good example is Dorchester County, Maryland. This is this line where we have sandy material from the center of Delmarva, and then we had some loess or finer materials deposited across here. So here's the Fort Mont right up here. And then you have the Elkton, this fine material that was deposited on top of the sand. And you can see it in Somerset County too. If you've ever dug down or looked at your soil maps in Somerset, you can have fine texture material, and a foot down you can have sand under there, depending on where you're at. And it's the same thing in Dorchester. It just runs up that coastline. So it's not just the surface of that soil. You might have, if your roots get down in this soil, if your roots get down deeper, they're going to hit that sandy layer. But of course, most of the time, we have a shallower water table. So even in one county, let's say that for years you've been farming in this region, and then you decide to buy a farm down here, where you have to start looking at those soil types, because it should have an effect. It should have different management. I haven't had to manage or sample those soils for ag, so I couldn't say. That's my educated guess for people in that region. So organic soils a lot of it's related to topography and inputs. And this is an important thing about organic matter when we talk about it, especially when we're talking about maintaining or adding it. So a forest soil is very easy to build organic matter because the leaves keep dropping, the earthworms and rodents and everybody keeps mixing it into the soil. It builds up, we don't leave it behind. Ag soils, this can burn off really easy. You have to worry about how quickly you can lose that. And particularly, you can see this plow line here, how we've mixed some of this deeper into the soil. So decaying plants add organic matter to the soil. That organic matter is food for microbes, so it gets lost eventually if you don't keep adding it. If you have a wet area, slow decomposition. Look how dark this is. That tells you there's a lot of organic matter here because water slows decomposition. You do need additions, though. You need plant growth and more inputs. So agriculture, if you have a highly productive field that leaves a lot of residue behind, like corn production can increase organic matter over time because of all the residue you get from that plant material. If you have a highly productive field and you manage it well. Soil organic matter is a natural source of nutrients, but it's different than, say, soils that form from bedrock because you have to maintain or add it. So if you have a farm that had never had the trees chopped down and you knock them down and you plant there, then you could consider that soil organic to be a natural source of nutrients, but you're going to mine it over time and run out of it. You have to add some of this back. So before we remove the wetland or forest, we built up organic matter. There's atmospheric deposition of nutrients, tree roots pulling nutrients up out of the ground, concentrating at the surface. So organic matter can be great for that, but you have to manage it. The guess in general is that for every 1% organic matter, you're going to release 10 to 40 pounds of nitrogen each year. That's a large range because it depends on your weather. Obviously, if you have a swamped out farm for a little while, that's going to slow down breakdown. If you have cold weather, it's going to slow down breakdown. Plus the quality matters. That's why you have to keep adding it back. So it's not enough for crop production, but it supplements it. But when people talk about, oh, we need to return to natural systems and natural cycling, an ecosystem that just cycles nutrients in place can survive on 40 pounds. And they're not trying to maximize production. They're trying to survive. When you're growing crops, you're trying to produce the most crop you can on that acreage to pay all your costs. So that's where you have to have inputs beyond what the soil can provide. But the soil can provide some, and you can manage that. So organic matter is basically the recycling of living things, everything. When you sample a soil and get an organic matter back, if there were microbes living in that soil, when they send it for processing, they're including the organic matter numbers because we don't know the difference. When we burn that off and get the carbon, it gets everything. So these plants are pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere, and a lot of your organic matter that you're building is adding carbon back to the soil. They're going to pull nutrients up. They're going to concentrate stuff in the surface. If you fertilize, it's going to go into your plant and it can concentrate in the surface, whatever you don't pull off in the grain. So when plants die, they're going to add carbon, a lot of carbon building. One of the only ways you add nutrients through a plant is going to be a legume. That's why we talk about cycling crop rotations with legumes. We talk about clover as a cover crop. You can add nitrogen that way because they have that symbiotic relation with bacteria. And it recycles any nutrients not exported. We always have to remember that about ag, that when you grow a crop, all those nutrients that you put into it, or it pulled out of the soil or it got out of the atmosphere, whatever was natural, is going to be fed to somebody. And if that's not returning as biosolids, then it's gone. And we have to put it back in. So yes, soils have natural levels of nutrients. You can recycle some of them, but if you're growing things as crops, you're shipping those nutrients off. You have to return some back to the soil. You can manage the cycling, but you're still always going to have to fertilize at some point if you're farming. So organic matter can build. This is a sandy soil that was probably low in organic matter, just like this dune. If you can allow plants to stabilize, you can allow those roots to grow and add organic matter. You can build organic matter over time in almost any soil, but there's a plateau of what you can do. And sandy soils don't hold as much as clay soils. You can only add so much. So most of the nutrients that we find in organic matter are probably just the natural levels of nutrients in the soil that are moved upward and recycled. Legumes add nitrogen, atmosphere deposits, but most of the nutrients in your organic matter are going to be recycled from the soil. If you're talking about calcium, magnesium, potassium, if you're not fertilizing with it, that didn't come from anywhere else but the soil. So outside of nitrogen, we're mostly recycling in situ nutrients. We can add nitrogen through legumes, but more than likely, if you're looking at building soil health or using cover crops, you're probably cycling as many nutrients in place as possible. So green manures, cover crops, soil organic matter are mostly recycling nutrients that are already there, unless you're adding this fertilizer. Nitrogen is our most limiting nutrient, so legumes definitely help. They definitely help build nitrogen. But organic matter only provides you nutrients if you keep building it. You have to maintain and build it. You have to keep the residues there. You have to keep as many nutrients in place as possible. So, but for growing crops, most soils need additions. You're not gonna produce 300 bushels of corn off of natural soil levels of nutrients. You're gonna have to add some. There are levels from the atmosphere, and it's important to understand it because it can supplement, it can add some nutrients to your soil. You've heard the talks over the past, it's now getting to be 20 years old, but how before we cleaned our coal stacks, we had sulfur deposition, a lot of sulfur deposition. And now we're having less, so now we're having to look at, are we having issues with sulfur in some of our soils, especially the sandy ones? But your atmosphere, a lot of what your atmosphere is adding is the carbon, the organic matter carbon. That's what you're mostly getting. It has oxygen, it has hydrogen, that's some of your plant nutrients. But the ones that we really talk about that you can add as fertilizers from the atmosphere that are coming in all the time are nitrogen and sulfur. It also contains dust. We'll talk about that in a second, that can be deposited and add nutrients. So it is a source. You can consider it, but it's not going to be your only source. You leave this in a forest, fine. It'll cycle in place. You start growing crops, you can mine that really quickly. So besides legumes, we do have atmospheric nitrogen. Things like lightning will add nitrate to your soil. It's not a lot, but lightning does create some nitrate. Our atmosphere you're breathing right now, 78% nitrogen. You're surrounded by it. There's plenty of nitrogen. It's just not plain available or reactive. It has to be a nitrate or ammonium. Think UAN. It has to be in those forms. We have trace end gases, we have pollutants. The nitrogen you breathe, that's inert, it doesn't bother you. N2, it can be fixed by lightning and become nitrate. It's just not a lot. It was enough to help ecosystems develop. It's not enough for crop production, but it does happen. What legumes do is they have a symbiotic relationship with bacteria. So if you've ever grown a legume and you've inoculated it, what you're trying to do is make sure that the microbes that work with that soil root, with that plant root, to help pull nitrogen in, the legume gives the microbe energy, and in return, the microbe gives the nitrogen to the legume, and it builds up inside the tissue, and when it dies, it can leave the nitrogen behind. That's why the soybean has so much protein in it. So worldwide, naturally, they were at about 8 to 12 pounds an acre, enough to sustain, not enough to grow crops. That's why we've always called it a green manure. Legumes were known as a green manure for, say, 150 years. We've known that. But corn needs 150 to 300 pounds of N in these soils. So 8 to 12 is not going to quite make it. Atmospheric sulfur, we do have sulfur depositions, volcanoes, coal-fired plants. Could be if you're too close, toxic levels, but probably not anymore. H2S is a natural sulfur gas, wetlands and volcanoes, not necessarily crop production. And it's very important for natural systems, but it does help. It does get deposited. There's an interesting book. It's 20 years old now. He's talking about collapses of different societies, and what he was looking at. Easter Island. One of the things he realized was how far out Easter Island was from this line of volcanoes. So you saw that basalt we showed earlier and how fertile that rock was. There's a lot of volcanic dust that carries downwind and was naturally adding fertility to these soils. So a lot of these societies were being fertilized with maybe out without realizing it. But the further you were away from these lines, you weren't getting that fertility. So once the landscape was deforested and nutrients weren't being added back, you actually might have seen, I know there's difference of opinions, that Easter Island, it was deforested, it lost some of its fertility, and that might have helped seal its fate in terms of society, because you need to be able to grow your own food. You need to be able to recycle nutrients or have inputs to keep things going. Saharan dust is another thing that naturally fertilizes the Amazon. This dust that's carried over here actually has quite a bit of phosphorus in it. So not good for the Sahara, although it's too dry. If it ever had moisture again, its phosphorus is actually being carried over and deposited here. We see some of it every year. You'll read about it. We get some dust coming here, but not like they're getting down here with the lines. So 182 million tons per year moved to sea, 2.7 million tons of dust over the Amazon, 22,000 tons of phosphorus moved across the atmosphere and deposited. Natural system, sure. Agriculture, it's just, you consider it supplemental. So our most important nutrient that we can manage because of legumes is nitrogen. We can use legumes to do that, but not necessarily some of the others. So natural soil fertility, you can call in situ or in place. Yes, it's there. But we also have natural leaching. We're on the East Coast. We have highly weathered soils. All the rainfall we get, any nutrients that's out here in the pore water, it's moving off. So we lose those over time versus other parts of the country. So leaching naturally occurs. It's higher in areas with greater rainfall and greater temperatures. So it's going to affect vegetation production. So our soils, even if you add nutrients to them, they leach out over time. That's why you have to lime a soil every couple of years. It's not just crop production pulling calcium, magnesium off. It's also that we have natural amounts of leaching that are going to move that down in the profile. It's really interesting when you start looking at a general soil map of our soil orders. Here's our ultisols in orange, highly weathered clay soils you see across here. You see the Appalachian there with their limestone valley. And you can see that we have sandy but highly weathered soils here in Delmarva. And then as you get west, here's your desert soils, very easy to see. Here's your corn belt and their mollisols and their high organic soils. Well, look at where the crop production is. You can see that on all this forest here, we have sandy soils or clay soils that aren't very nutrient rich, but we have these coastal soils, easy to manage, add irrigation to. How much crop production, how lucky we are in Delmarva. when you look at us versus the rest of the country or the rest of the mid-Atlantic, it's always amazing to me to see how much agriculture is concentrated from Delmarva to Pennsylvania down this coastal plain, but then the rest of the East, how much better it is for forestry for them. So we're really lucky in our area that we can grow crops so well and be similar to what we call the Corn Belt out here with their soil types. So they have natural levels of fertility that built up over time. What happens as you move west is you get less rainfall. So you had more grasses, and the grass roots died and built up the organic matter in their soil. So it's actually less rainfall that helped produce their fertile organic soils. So you can see it right here. Here's an Ultisol from Virginia. Here's a Mollisol from the Midwest. These grasses, the roots die. So roots are very important to organic matter. Maintaining good roots in your soil and leaving them behind is the residue that you leave on the surface probably goes off as CO2, a lot of it, but your roots in the soil break down and stay there. So having a good root system, this is one of the benefits of cover crops, that year-round cover. You're keeping roots in the ground more often, then you probably are helping build your organic matter. So with all of this, we're not getting into fertilizers. This is the last slide. The point was our soils have natural levels of nutrients. Some soils have more than others, particularly when you're talking about micronutrients. And when you have to manage micronutrients, it depends on what the soil formed from. But you can look at these soil types and figure out, particularly with management over time, which ones are going to need more attention. But you can only count on in situ soil nutrients so much. So when we talk about soil health and we talk about cover crops, a lot of what we really are looking at is the legumes and the nitrogen, and then the building of organic matter and the cycling in place and reducing erosion and all kinds of benefits like that. Some soils are going to have more zinc in them, and having a healthy soil can mean that you have more access to it. It can mean that those roots are in there and get access, that you have good pore space for roots to move through, that the microbes are actively helping cycle nutrients. That's all true. But if your soil has no zinc naturally, then no matter how much soil health you do, you're not going to improve the amount of zinc you can get. You're going to have to supplement it with a fertilizer. So sometimes, every once in a while, someone says soil health will solve all your fertility problems, and it's not true. They can improve management, but they're not going to bring in a nutrient that's not there. So then we have to supplement our organic fertilizers or our mineral fertilizers. Nutrients have to be added to crop production. Natural systems, they don't. You can get them started. If you're going to grow a forest, you can add nutrients up front. And if you let it go and you're not trying to, if you're just trying to have a forest to have it there, it's going to build, it's going to cycle. Phosphorus will come in from dust, nitrogen, sulfur will come in. There's natural levels. It'll make it fine. When you're in crop production, you are maximizing growth. And the soil is never going to have enough of all the nutrients. You're going to have to fertilize with something. So obviously, we do a lot more of those talks. Let's see, and we're at the end. Do we have any questions about some of what I covered? I know we don't have a lot of bedrock across Delmarva, but it's good to understand the difference across the region because we meet and talk to each other. And sometimes people don't understand on the coastal plain how much more work you might have to do to maintain organic matter, to fertilize some of these soils and some of the issues that we deal with.
All right, and you can either type questions into the chat box, or we don't have a huge group, so you can unmute yourself and ask anything, pick Jarrod's brain, whatever you want to do. While you're thinking of questions or comments, be sure if you need nutrient management or nutrient voucher credits, make sure that you are registered, or if you are watching with someone, that I get your information. Just let me know if there's more than one person watching from your account. And then again, you're going to need 2 hours of training. So if you need nutrient voucher credits, that's 2 hours of training. So make sure that you are signed up for enough of these sessions. Next week's session is going to be management options for farmers facing saltwater intrusion on the eastern shore of the Chesapeake Bay. All right, we do have a question in the chat box. Let's see. Do you want me to read it to you, or do you want to read it?
Yeah, I can read it. On the subject of atmospheric nitrogen, what's your thought on biologicals such as pivot bio that turn atmospheric N into a usable form? So I think There's some positive research with a biological like Pivot Bio, and I've also seen the numbers on it, depending on your soil type and your environment, that it might not be economically work for every farm. Arkansas State just had some good information on potential nitrogen that comes from it. The issue with adding any kind of microbe to your soil is, as you're farming it right now, what's in there is adapted to the environment you're managing. Whatever nutrients you're adding, if you're adding manure, if it's drained, if it's tile drained, anything like that, if it doesn't have cover crops, it does have cover crops. The microbes that are surviving right there are the ones that can do it. If you bring a microbe from outside that can't handle your field environment, then they're not going to stick around and they're not going to give you that benefit. It's just like the reason that you want to consider with your legumes every year inoculating the seed, because whatever inoculant you put there might not have been able to compete with the other rhizobacteria in the soil. So I am very interested in biologicals, but I'm cautious that research from other states won't necessarily work here on our soil types on everybody's farm the same way. All right, yeah. So Richard Wilkins, I'm happy to hear scientists say fertilizer must be added to optimize yield. So, and I think we'll keep seeing this with the term regenerative farming now. There's always going to be the next, we called it soil quality, then soil health, it's regenerative farming. As a soil scientist, managing your soils, adding cover crops, reducing erosion, I love soil health for all of that. I love soil, so any way you can treat and maintain and build that is great, but you guys also have to consider your livelihoods. And so balancing that out, I do think soil health helps recycle nutrients. I think there's a part of soil health that's going to benefit crop production, because in some ways there is the frontier that we haven't hit. We know how to fertilize, we know how to maximize production, but in some of our soils, I do think managing those soils better can increase yields if you're reducing compaction, if you're helping cycle nutrients, if you're helping roots get down to the soil. So there is some things to regenerative ag I like, but the problem isn't always the scientist as much as sometimes the media likes a good story and it sounds nice to have these, they like generalizations, whereas we have to go farm to farm, and everybody's different and everybody's problems are different. So yeah, I like all of it. I just, as a scientist, like to keep it balanced. You must state it to be effective and productive in ag. You must add nutrients. That being said, you feel the current policy for nutrient management are balanced and effective. In terms of nitrogen and phosphorus, it's always going to be a moving target. The nutrients, I think, you're always going to have nitrogen. We need to get better at managing it. And farm to farm, I think the nitrogen management is probably close. What we need to get better at is efficient, because no matter what, you're losing nitrogen. We do need to get better at giving you better tools so that you don't need as much nitrogen. Because if you put down 1 pound for every bushel of corn, corn's not using that entire pound. It's inefficient, and we'll never reach 100%, but we can do better. Phosphorus is more difficult, because I think that some of the policy with phosphorus, we always have to, I think, with phosphorus, keep doing research to make sure that if we're telling someone that they can't apply phosphorus, that it actually is leaving that field. Some fields, if you have 1,000 parts per million in your field phosphorus, then yeah, you don't need any more, and we do have to balance that out. But I leave the nutrient management policy up to the nutrient management specialists. Then farmers don't get mad at me as much. I'll let those people take the heat.
All right, good questions and comments. Looks like we got another one come through.
Can you get more bang for your buck with lime additions? And depends on how bad it is and what your soil type is. So yes, I think we're starting to try to do more variable rate lime work, because one of the biggest tweaks in some of our soils is pH that we need to do. But on our coastal soils, it's really easy to overshoot. If you have a field that has these clay layers next to sand layers, you can really mess it up with too much lime. But I do see a lot of fields where the pH is too low, but I don't always know where we need to hit it. Micronutrients in particular, your plant roots, the microbes in your soil, everything, having that pH right is a good idea. So yeah, if you've been skipping out on that, the problem is once the cost of everything is up, managing each one of these things and tweaking it right, sometimes it would have been better if the fertilizers were lower. Then that's when you try to figure out what pH works best on this farm, versus this year where it could end up being a crapshoot with the cost of everything. But I do think if you haven't looked at your lime in the past, if you haven't checked your pHs, if you have pHs that are 5, you probably want to bring that up this year. But you don't need to go out and put 2 tons. You just need to inch that thing up some.
Hey, Jarrod, this is Jenny. Can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
I had a discussion with a farmer this week on the same issue about, pH in our soil and lime. When we look at that chart, that shows the uptake, what pH it has to be for all the nutrients to uptake. We had a discussion about, is our pH too high to uptake some of these micronutrients? And are we, instead of telling a farmer to put on a ton, should we be telling them maybe to put on a half a ton so that breaks down a little faster? Any thoughts on that?
I have thoughts, but not enough research.
Okay.
We're starting to try to look at it. I'm very cautious. If anybody asks me how much lime they should put out and it's springtime, I would never put out. I'd be very cautious putting out a ton, especially if you need to look at the quality of that lime, the CCE, the particle size, how fast it's going to break down. If you have a pH that's 5, that's where you have to start considering adding the lime. But some of these micronutrient deficiencies are so hard to see because you only see them with a tissue sample. One of the ones that consistently comes up that I can tell you for sure is if you have a Falsington soil, particularly in Delaware, you probably have a manganese deficiency, and then you want to keep that pH lower. But I've seen people with pHs of 6.5 and no issues in terms of visual deficiencies. Doesn't mean it's not there. But I would be very cautious if you're thinking about putting out lime this spring, right before you plant, and you're not tilling it in, it's sitting on the surface where that seed's at, and it's driving that pH. You think you're adding lime to make that pH 6, but at that surface, it might be 7, 7.5, just in that upper inch where that seed is. And sometimes those roots get down lower and they find the micronutrient they need. But yeah, I'm cautious because my opinion from the crop production here is people are hurt by lower pH, but it doesn't seem to, it's not so low, and we don't have so much aluminum that it's not just destroying the crop. So if you want to inch it up, or you want to take one field and do a half a ton, and another do a ton and do some tissue testing, it would help me because we can't do all this work. It's very helpful if farmers are doing some trials on the side and then can say, hey, on this soil type, I saw this, so we don't give bad advice, because I just don't know.
I think that's our problem. Our soil types vary so much. It's very hard.
We started before the pandemic. We have a Ferris that has a pH meter on it, and we just got a variable rate spreader, so we can start trying to figure out how can we tweak this, because it's not just your pH. You have to understand that buffer pH, which relates to your texture, and see if we can't help people improve it. It might not. Our soils might be so variable, it might be hard to do.
Thanks, Jarrod.
Mm-hmm.
Good presentation.
Thanks.
Could we get some consultants involved with that?
Oh yeah.
That might be a good collaborative effort if they were interested in it.
Well, they do see a lot. There's a lot of information out there that they see, and we just need to work together more, trying to figure some of this out. We try to do some projects with manganese. It's just so we've done some manganese with soybeans and got no results out of it. And then the next year someone has a problem with it. It's just year to year.
It's Delmarva.
Yeah, I mean, we've had micronutrient projects here that don't move stuff at all. And then I'll see an article where someone improved their yield with it. We can't, I think if you want to know the bigger issues in this area, I keep seeing zinc. And if you have a certain soil type, it's manganese. But I haven't seen the other ones. Even with boron, we've been adding boron and not seeing a boost, but it's one soil type. It just depends on your management.
We still can take some more questions if you have them. Jarrod is our resident expert on soils. He knows more than anybody I've ever met on soils, so take advantage.
Too much.
Another one related. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
This is Mike Milkey. I guess what gets a little confusing with the soil samples. I noticed myself with putting some on this spring, even put on some fall, some other places. And I noticed what I put on this spring and some of the stuff is really slower working. And what a lot of it is, we're not really tilling the soil much anymore, So I guess, that you're adding that lime towards the top. So is any suggestions on the soil samples, or just continue to take them consistently so you can compare year to year?
Yeah, so Delaware's recommendation specifically, if you're sampling to lime, is to do that upper 2 inches only, because they know it sits there. If it's no-till and you're looking to lime, you take a separate sample because we know it's going to sit there. Versus if you're looking, oh, well, I'm going to use this lime for 3 years. Again, that's why I tell people, if you can lime in the fall, give it time to react, move down. And you can see it definitely moves down, but it takes time. So if you're only taking one soil sample every 3 years, and yeah, you do that 8 inches, and maybe if you can afford it, because there's travel across the fields, you spread those lime additions out to try to maintain it. But if you just want to lime, I'd do that upper 2 inches and no-till. So is there an opportunity to look at foliar fertilizer an option? Yes. I think a foliar fertilizer, again, if you have the equipment, if you have the time, it's usually a lower rate because you get it on that leaf and right into the plant. And our extension agent here at our research station done a lot of work with different micronutrients and still not been able to move the dial, but we must not have issues in those fields that we're looking at. So I like foliar fertilizer. If you're going across the field anyway, if you're going to do an application, if you can stick it through your pivot and you need it, yes. You can use a lower rate and you're more guaranteed you're getting it into the plant. You still have to get that timing right. Micronutrients don't seem to hurt yield as much if you're waiting later in the season versus having something up front. And the problem with adding a micronutrient to your soil is most of them are very immobile. So if you put it in a band, it's more concentrated, more available, but the roots have to get to it. You add potassium, it probably moves around some. Nitrogen moves around some. But micronutrients, most of them don't move very much. So foliar is a better option if you have the equipment and the time to do it.
All right, I don't see any other questions. We'll give it another minute or so. Again, you can unmute if you want to. Sometimes it's easier than typing into the chat box. And I don't think we'll have anybody talking over anybody, so it shouldn't be a problem. But thank you all for joining us. There was a lot of interaction with the questions at the end. So that usually means that you enjoy it. If you have questions, it usually means you enjoy the topic. I think Jarrod wins so far for most questions.
That's actually the most I've ever gotten.
Because they weren't forced into it. Most people are here because they enjoy the topic, or they had.
That's good. That's what sometimes I regret about like Ag Week. I know some people are there just for the credit. So when I see people show up at this and they don't have to, it's nice when you're extension and people actually want to hear what you have to say.
And we do like feedback. I know I like to get feedback from people
Yeah.
who enjoy it. So I'm sure Jarrod does too.
Yeah, I like to know if I was too dense in what I said.
I was thinking a lot of Flintstone stuff at the beginning though.
I know I was going through it right before this. I was like, oh man, I forgot how much rocks were in here. And now this is a more exclusive Delmarva audience. I was like, oh, it's still good to just know. I've always found people, the geography part, people like, now they can drive across the state and look at some of this if they haven't thought about it before. I always had friends in college that liked that once you pointed out to them the differences.
The phosphorus, I think I've heard that before. The phosphorus coming across the ocean. It's interesting.
Yeah, yeah.
Somebody enjoys talks on rocks.
Yeah, I just, this is pulled from the fertility class. I pulled some of this from, I teach students on campus.
And
Because you have to have that balance in there. There is a lot of talk about natural fertility. I'm like, we need to understand what's going on here in our system.
And if you, I know we have a couple of regulars on here. If you have any feedback on the series itself, this was a trial run, mostly because it needed to provide opportunity for nutrient management credits for the farmers. But I can see value in this kind of stuff long term. We do this for our commercial poultry growers on a monthly basis. The talks were all, I either picked the speaker or the topic. So I either picked a topic because of the speaker and let them pick their topic, or it was a talk that I saw that I thought might benefit. But if you have ideas, these were just stuff I go off of from working with farmers for 14 years. But if you have ideas of stuff you'd like to see, let me know. And if we get enough interest, we could do this more on like a regular basis. It wouldn't be every week, but it might be like every month. Yeah, I figured wintertime would be good for farmers, especially at lunch. The only problem is a lot of our farmers down here have either never done Zoom or internet can be an issue for people. So I have talked people through getting on the phone for some of the webinars. And if you really like to hear Jarrod speak, he's going to do one for pastures, 3 weeks, I think. Because mine's next week. So I think yours is 2 weeks after that.
Yeah, I just saw it on my calendar. I was like, oh yeah, I remember that one too.
Yeah, here's a reminder, Jarrod.
I'm on it.
That
one was nice because you told me what you wanted. People don't
Yeah.
like just give a talk. You're like, I want this. I'm like, I can do that.
Well, that's my people for that one. I'm speaking as the client too for the pasture one. Because I think most of the really bad looking pasture pictures that I have in my talk, I took out back. So nobody can complain. They're my pastures. All right. Well, I don't see any other questions. Again, thank you for joining us and thank you for the feedback. Looks like everybody enjoyed it. We have very few, I don't think anybody dropped off. I don't think anybody left on purpose. We may have lost connections a couple of times, but everybody stuck through it. So, I mean, good. So, all right. I'm only operating one computer this time. Extension career in Somerset County. So that's why some people are familiar with them, and then some of you may know him from Delaware. All right, I'm going to end the meeting. Again, thank you, everyone. And I'll see you next week for the salt intrusion talk.
All right. Thanks, Megan.
Thank you.